Good day, everyone. Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Wherever you are in the world, we are here for our live event and continue to discuss cybersecurity risk management. I'm Stanley Lee from NetSwitch, and here today we have Sean Mahoney, my partner, and another partner you haven't seen, Fred Doyle. So I'm gonna let Sean to introduce Fred, and then we're going to jump right into our discussion. Today is going to be an interesting one for me, at least, for the
Great,
geeky guys.
great. Thanks, Haley. It should be based upon what we were going through when we were doing the trial for this thing. Fred's got some great information today. So I'd like to introduce our guest today, Fred Doyle. Fred has over
Yes, he's
40
not our
years,
guest.
40
He never
years of. He's not on these live events every time we do these things.
true.
But he has over 40 years of experience in IT and electrical engineering. He has been supervisor of criminal investigations and forensics at the town of Manlius Police Department. He's been the senior rapid response malware analyst at iDefense, assistant director of intelligence and director of vulnerability research labs at VeriSign, director of technical intelligence at iSight Partners, director of special projects at FireEye, senior security architect at Presbyterian Health Services. He holds ISC Squared's CISP and ISACA's CRISC certifications. He's also had the great pleasure of working with us and playing a key role in the development of NetSwitch's security risk assessment platform that we fondly call SARA. He's been instrumental in the development of risk qualification and quantification within SARA. And by his membership in Mensa, he will be by far the smartest person speaking today. So,
Well,
Fred, we are thrilled you're here today to join us.
yes. And I'm sure that people ask me why I've been hiding Fred behind the scene for so long.
The
So
secret
one of the
weapon.
question always come up to me is one of the question always come up to me, Stanley, you keep talking about, the subject is so complex and so confusing. I said, well, yeah, I've been trying to simplify my messages for our audience. And that is the hardest part of our business development. And you're thinking what I talked about is confusing or complex. I said, wait until I bring in our partner to talk about the complexity and confusing part. So that's why I said, okay, Fred, you got to talk about it as a cybersecurity architect. What has been changed since the time that we started working together? So a little bit about the history between us and Fred. So Fred started with NetSwitch back in 2015, 2014, if I remember correctly. That was before Gartner had started the term manage, detect, and response provider. And we were very happy to be one of the first 12 pioneer in that category. And at that point that we already delivered to a global, luxurious global hotel chain, and within 1 year that we were able to reduce 85% of the security incidents, and then over 90% on the response time to those security incidents. So that was before Gartner had coined that term. So from that point onwards, we continue to develop what Sean had talked about, Sarah. And also tied it back into today's conversation, Sean just posted in our LinkedIn group, the cyber risk governance group recently, and the title was National Security Strategy. And why we adding the GRC element into the technical component is because that adds the complexity into the subject of cybersecurity. And Sean have even mentioned talking about, well, we're gonna have a cybersecurity law being enforced. So that ties it into Fred's conversations today and continue our discussion in cybersecurity risk management based on the NIST 8286 as a strategy or as a management approach. So I'm going to turn this over to Fred.
Okay, thank you, Stanley. Thank you, Sean. Yeah, the first thing I'd like to do is answer one of the questions that Stanley asked earlier, And this is about an 85% reduction in not only events, but also response time. And this was our proof of concept, if you will, for using a risk-based approach to address cybersecurity issues. Now, remember, this is back in 2016, where risk-based approaches were kind of novel in cybersecurity. But what we did was we took the data that we had from different devices, from a SIM, from firewalls, et cetera, and we looked at all of the alerts that we were getting. And then we assessed those alerts against what they were actually attacking. So we actually pulled in a value based thing too. And then we said, okay, in your particular instance, in your profile, if we reduce these events, against these targets. And also, if we also reduce what's available as an asset, then we'll reduce the risk. And by doing that, and by weeding out false positives and allowing known traffic that was alerting anyhow, it was known good traffic, we were able to reduce the number of monthly events by 85%. So that answers your question, Stanley. So now we'll get up to the show itself, and thank you all for joining us. This we are using NIST Interagency Report (IR) 8286 series as a jumping off point to dive deeper into risk and the approach of using cyber risk to deal with cybersecurity. So NIST IR 8286 is actually several reports. You have the overriding 8286 integrating cybersecurity risk management. I'm not going to read the bullets on these, so feel free to read those yourself. And then you've got the 8286A, which is identifying estimating cybersecurity risk. And then B is prioritizing cybersecurity risk. C is staging cybersecurity risk. And D, using business impact analyses to inform risk prioritization and response. So this is a very comprehensive interagency report, and it's meant to, as the first slide showed, spark further industry discussion, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So what is risk? We got to start there because in the IT industry, it's not like the financial industry where everybody knows exactly what risk is. IT industry often conflates the word risk with threats, weaknesses, vulnerabilities, exposures, attacks, you name it, everything is a risk. In fact, you'll see products out there with the word risk in their name, which have nothing to do at all with risk. Oh, they might be a list of threats, or there might be a list of bad IP addresses, malicious IP addresses. But none of those are risk unless you tie it to the definition of risk, which is the arithmetic product of probability and impact. It's that simple. So risk equals P times I. And where does this come from? This comes from Frank Knight's seminal work on risk. And this is an a priori risk. That's the formula. It's called the classical risk equation. Now, throughout NIST 8286, um, risk is addressed in terms of qualitative and quantitative risk. Right here is the ubiquitous risk management heat map, where you'll see that we have different colors, implying that red, of course, is bad and green, of course, is good, and then the colors in between are not so bad or not so good, etc. But I'd like you to just concentrate on this heat map here and imagine that you have 10 different heat maps from 10 different systems. How do you integrate those risks? If you have all reds, is it all red? If you have a lot of green and one red, is it mostly green? No, risk is in and of itself a standalone component of the analysis, which takes us to the importance of risk management. And I love this phrase because it's so true. Everything we see in the 8286 series, or for that matter, any any risk framework, is a theory. And in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. Take, for example, the NIST approach to risk. We've got a cybersecurity framework, in this case, NIST CSF. And then we've got cybersecurity control frameworks, in this case, NIST 853. And then we've got a cybersecurity assessment framework, in this case, the Carnegie Mellon Capabilities Maturity Model, which I'll go into in just a second. And then we've got the cybersecurity risk management framework, which is NIST RMF. And putting all of these things together, we can magically come up with a risk for an organization. Now, let me discuss each one of these in a little bit more depth because it really applies to the theory. The cybersecurity program framework is 5 functions, 23 categories, and 108 subcategories that define um, the scope of IT security within an organization. It's a great framework. Nearly 70% of all organizations have actually adopted this framework, and it's good. It gives you good guidance and direction on what policies you need, what approaches you need, what procedures you need, and everything else like that. Now, the 853 cybersecurity control framework is a list of controls, and controls are just that. They control the security uh, for your organization. For example, you'll have identity and access management controls that controls who is allowed in. You have firewall controls, which controls what traffic is allowed in. So all of these controls are essential. Cybersecurity assessment framework, the Carnegie Mellon CMM. Um, this is it judges your maturity in the cybersecurity program. So what it looks at is it looks at the CSF and the NIST 853, and it gives you a level of maturity. Now, why do they use maturity and not security? Because security cannot be measured, but maturity of an organization can. So if, for example, IDAM1 from the cybersecurity program framework, if IDAM1 says that you're supposed to have an inventory of all of your devices and you don't, well, you're not very mature in that area. And how can you protect what you don't know you have? So that's where the cybersecurity assessment framework comes in. And then the cybersecurity risk management framework actually could circle around all of those things and say, okay, we now have the base that you need. So you are going to follow the circle and rinse and repeat, and you'll have a great cybersecurity and cyber risk program. Now, this is in theory. All of this, however, is so complicated that it's typically only reviewed in whole once or twice a year. Um, and part of that is because organizations don't do this themselves typically. They see it too daunting. Oh, how are we going to grade against the NIST CSF? How are we going to implement all this stuff? We'll bring in one of the big fours, Deloitte, KPMG, et cetera, and we'll have them assess our maturity. And next year we'll do the same thing. The problem is, in practice, we have all of these external forces that are on a daily basis changing our risk posture. So we have the ransomware, the phishing, the social engineering, DDoS. All of these things are impacting our day to day risk, which is not going to show up in the yearly audit or the yearly assessment. So now for a philosophical interlude. As we as we saw from the previous slide, we have the 4 different components, and the thought here follows what's called a logical fallacy of composition, or in this case, decomposition. If we can take something and decompose it to its native elements and then roll it back up, we have risk. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works with risk. Risk is a complex system. Um, a good example of the logical fallacy of composition, for example, is hydrogen is a gas. Oxygen is a gas. When you combine hydrogen and oxygen, you get a gas, right? No, you get H2O, which is a liquid. So the liquid is an emergent property of those items, as risk is an emergent property of all those four things that we just discussed. Not saying they're not important. In fact, we use those as the key. We just take a different approach to applying those. Um, so risk is a complex system. Why is this important? Because very few, if any, complex system can be understood. Think of the stock market. If somebody comes to you and tells you, I have solved the complex system of the stock market, I can predict with certainty what the stock market is going to do tomorrow or next week or next year. What are you going to think of that person? Well, you're going to think he's a charlatan or maybe a thief, or maybe he works at SVB. I don't know. But the bottom line is, as a complex system, we cannot predict what it's going to do. Now, what can we do with complex systems? We can control them. And think about driving a car. You do not, when you're going down to the corner grocery store, you do not say, okay, these are all the things I'm going to do and I'm going to get there. No, you get in the car, you start it up, you look behind you, adjust the mirrors, put the seatbelt on, you back out of the driveway, drive down the road, and every second, every millisecond that you're in that car, you are controlling a complex system. You don't control it once a year, or you'd never go to the store. You have to control it continuously. And we've already talked about management versus prediction. When you're driving the car, you're managing that car. Are you in the right lane? Are you too close to the center curb? Is there a person up in front of you that you have to weave a little bit to the left or the right to avoid? So you are managing the system, you're not predicting it. And then we go back to risk management frequency. Is once a year enough for IT risk? Well, if you look at this slide again, with all of those external perturbations, all of the attacks, once a year is not enough. It has to be continuous. Didn't even need to talk to that slide. Okay, here's an example of managing risk, not on a real-time basis, not on a second by second, although it could be done, but this is on a daily basis. And it just shows you how the risk goes up and down even on a daily basis. Now, if this were instead of daily, if this were hourly, or if this were by the minute, it would go up and down even more. But for the effect, you'll see that there is a correlation between the threats, the orange, and the risk up top most of the time. Most of the time, additional threats come in and the risk increases. But you'll also see toward the end there that there's a correlation at first between the risk and the threats, but then it goes down. So this is the type of stuff that only risk management will give you. You can't just look at the threats. You can't just look at the asset values. You have to look at the product of the two. Now, also, because we're talking risk here, one of the key things for risk management is to use both risk elements, both probability and assets to to your advantage. You want to reduce the probability, but barring that, you can actually reduce the value of the assets that are attackable through things like sensible record retention. Oh, we got to keep records forever. Do you really? And if you do they have to be online forever? Or can you take those offline, put them in cold storage, and reduce that attack surface, reduce the impact if you are compromised? So that's just an example of real time risk management. So, by the way, okay, we've talked exclusively about NIST because we, pulled this off the 8286, and of course, NIST IR 8286 is going to talk about NIST stuff. But these are other IT security framework standards and regulations that you have to worry about. COBIT, which is ISACA, which as Sean introduced me, I have the ISACA C-risk certification. COBIT is very big into managing risk controls. But you've got the 8253 we've already talked about, all these other security frameworks and controls, high trust, GDPR, etc. They're all very similar. They're not plug and play different, but you can actually use as many of these or as few as these as you want. For example, we have found that the CIS controls are probably more comprehensive than the NIST 853 for most of the customers. So who knows? Maybe a customer comes by tomorrow and we find out that the COSO controls are better. So the flexibility in all these frameworks and controls is vital to the way we approach things. But we also recognize that NIST CSF is quickly becoming the de facto industry standard, and so we're going to respect that. Oh, and by the way, also there's within industries, and Sean mentioned I work as a senior security architect at Presbyterian. We have the Health Insurance Portability and Accountable Act, also known in healthcare as HIPAA. Although if you go to most healthcare people, they'll say, yeah, HIPAA, and ask what HIPAA stands for, and they can't remember what it is. But that was just one of the funny things that I found. But anyhow, we have HIPAA, which has a completely unique set of criteria and requirements. And right here is a good illustration of the difference between HIPAA on the left and the NIST CSF on the right. HIPAA high level versus very defined. And one of the reasons I like the NIST CSF is because it is well defined, and you can dive as deep as you want or stay as high as you want. So you're talking policy versus defined guidance. HIPAA hasn't changed in years, but NIST has changed a lot. In fact, they're coming out with version 2 toward the end of 2024, I think it is. Um, HIPAA is required under federal law. But let me give you a caveat there. Most HIPAA says, whenever possible, do this. So you just have to say, okay, it wasn't possible for this particular thing. So there are a lot of caveats in the requirements under federal law. NIST CSF is voluntary. Um, Penalties for noncompliance. There are a couple things that you absolutely have to comply with, or you get fined. Um, no penalties for not following NIST CSF. HIPAA, of course, specific to healthcare. Um, NIST CSF actually started off as a critical infrastructure framework, and then other people glommed onto it and said, this is really useful. So, um, and again, HIPAA used for internal assessments. Um, NIST CSF more flexible on that.
My wife is like HIPAA. She's often saying, whenever possible, will you please do this? It's never possible.
Well, all I can say is you have a good wife because I don't get the whenever possible part of it. So yeah.
Do you see any changes forthcoming within HIPAA?
Not in HIPAA itself so much. I think you're going to see a lot of additional legislation. For example, high trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
The ability to share information electronically. Without high trust, I think a lot of medical practices still would have those files in the vertical filing cabinets with a DO and everything. So high trust has actually impacted that. HIPAA, I think, is a fairly set rule that's been working pretty well, provided you comply with it.
Right.
One other thing I want to point out here, and that's a good question. HIPAA is stagnant. It's static, as in point number 2 up here. But one of the things that happens when you take a healthcare organization and you bang it up against NIST CSF, industry wide, I think is 44% actually meet the level 3, which is mid range, just defined process, right? Managed process of NIST CSF when you apply the Carnegie Mellon CMM. So that's less than half of all healthcare organizations and facilities actually have good security. Are mature enough to have good security.
Yeah. Well, even what percentage is really truly compliant to HIPAA? because you have a lot of small practices that this is a big lift for them.
True. I would say most practices, I don't have a number on this, but I'd say probably 80 to 90% compliant with HIPAA
Hmm.
in its intent because of, you know, number four down there, the penalties for noncompliance. And this is the unfortunate part is in a lot of places, the compliance section is at least as large, if not larger, than the cybersecurity section because of the pending fines.
Yeah. Many of the organizations just end up going under. The practices going, they just disappear after they have an incident.
That's true. A lot of
Yeah.
places
Yeah.
have an incident and they go out of business because the prospective penalties,
Right.
or just the fact that they realize that the infrastructure involved and required, by the way, by the High Tech Act,
Hmm.
that's expensive to maintain using the current market and the current approaches.
True. True.
And I mean, when you're talking $300,000 for a state of the art firewall, okay, um, yeah, I can see that. Then you got to have people to maintain it, So
So you've talked about the risk and be able to understand your risk within your environment for any organization. And this is about bringing cybersecurity into the enterprise risk management platforms, environments that people have established already. Because they've always treated cybersecurity as separate. It's a technical issue. It's not a risk management issue. Where, from your perspective and your experience, do you see the starting point for an organization? And many of the people we talk to are, when the bulk of the businesses are small to mid-sized businesses. Not everybody's large enterprise.
mhm.
So the limited resources from a budget standpoint, from a skill standpoint, the skills gap alone is significant, not just in the U.S. but globally. So where's an organization supposed to start? How would you suggest?
My suggestion would be to go back up and in fact, let me back up to the proper slide here. This one will do. On the left-hand side, the NIST cybersecurity framework. I have seen organizations that have struggled with other frameworks. ISO
Mhm.
27001, for example. Okay, and they get in there, and 27001 is very IT security focused. It doesn't encompass the entire organization like NIST CSF does. So it's just IT security versus a more holistic approach. But the beauty, and I'm not going to say this often about NIST because some of what they do is not quite as elegant as the NIST CSF, but I got to give credit where credit is due. The NIST CSF has 5 functions, and you'll see the functions on there:
Right.
identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Now, each one of those functions has categories. So what they do is by breaking it down like that, using a tree view or a hierarchical view, whichever word you want to use, it actually makes it approachable and also separable across the organization. For example, my suggestion is that the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, the functions themselves, that director levels people focus on those. And then the director level would assign managers to worry about the categories. And then the managers would assign operational personnel or engineers to worry about the subcategory. So not only do you have a hierarchical structure in the framework itself, you have a hierarchical work structure as well, which, I mean, talk all you want about matrixed operations and everything else like that. The most efficient still is and always will be a hierarchical control.
Yeah, but they are afraid to change. Lots of people are afraid to change, especially with
Um,
the HIPAA compliance. It's like, hey, I already spent, 10 years of my effort to build up all the IT and cybersecurity and GRC. Why should I change?
well, that's the beautiful thing about the NIST CSF. If you're already HIPAA compliant across the board, then I'd say you are probably, in at least in security aspects, you are also NIST CSF compliant because there is an overlap between the two. In fact, every item of the NIST CSF crosswalks to HIPAA. And here's a good example. You've got the NIST to HIPAA crosswalk, IDAM1, already talked about that. Physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. And you can see over here that it applies to HIPAA security rule 45 CFR, those sections. So if you just inventory the systems, you knock out all of those sections in HIPAA.
But doesn't I have to start all over again in the process and going
No,
through the 5 functions?
no. If you know what sections you already satisfy in HIPAA, um, there is a crosswalk where we can say, yes, these are the sections that we have in HIPAA. Oh, look, you're already good here. And so it doesn't have to be a manual process. That can be automated. In
And go
fact,
back.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say one of the things on um, our tool is to be able to actually do that. You know, to
Yeah,
automate the
yeah, I was going to
process.
say that, tied it back into the risk management.
Right.
We talked about we've been working on the risk quantifications element and adding on top of this best practices in the last couple of years, in the last three
Hmm.
years. So, how does that risk register, the risk profile, and risk quantifications make any difference? And why should our audience needs to add that element into their best practices?
Okay. If you focus only on what you can see in IT, let's say you focus, and this goes back to our example when we had the meeting in San Francisco, and we spent 2 weeks talking about the POC, and then we did the POC um, about the difference in approach. Because if you're just focusing on attacks, on threats, on traditional security, and you're not looking what that's going up against, you're going to be floundering all the time
Mhm.
because you may have thousands of attacks on, let's say, clerical workstation that has no important data whatsoever. It's basically the receptionist calendar, right? Um, Quantitatively or qualitatively, if you use that heat map, that would be up here as a high. That's not really the case though, because there's no information on it. So changing to a risk-based approach just makes changing to a risk-based approach, provided you also commit to real-time management of it. Is the difference between having a Ferrari in your driveway and being able to effectively drive it to the grocery store, like your Ferrari, Stanley. Or is it a Lamborghini? I can't.
Both.
Yeah. So yeah, it all comes in using a risk-based approach to manage a complex system. And face it, we do that every day. When you cross the street, there is a risk to crossing the street. But we manage the risk by waiting for the green light, looking both ways, looking for the traffic, and only going when we know we can make it across.
But it
And
also tied it back into the behavior of the organization. And we keep talking about the three groups of stakeholders, right? So, from the business executive point of view, we have been pointed out in our previous podcasts and with our guests and talking about budget. The
Mm.
board of directors that they have limited understanding about IT, but now they are being forced to go act on cybersecurity and GRC. So that's a hard pill for them to swallow. And for the technologists and governors needs to present a a an easily digest and easily understandable communication to the board of executive and the C-suite so they can get the budget. And you laugh, and I'm sure that that's everybody's challenge and the people who are listening in, including the business owners, because now actually I'm preparing a deck for the small business owners because I have to try to convince them why cybersecurity is important. And for the similar type of reason, but of course in a different scale. And that seems to be the biggest hurdle that we hear. Is not that they don't want to spend, and in fact Sean had talked about it in the previous podcast and webinar. There are budget that is not being spent because a lot of, well, I would say our peers did a fantastic job in their marketing, and that confused everybody, including me. And that was the first thing I told, the small group of businesses. I mean, the small business owners. Is say, well, you have to define what that really means first before you're gonna go read into it. So I know it's a big question.
Well, yeah, let me talk about that. Number one, I always believe in under promise, over deliver. But I'll tell you, in the IT technology realm, it's over promise, under deliver because that's the expectation. Okay. And if you look at the progression, oh, antivirus will save you. Oh, now it's antivirus and firewalls will save you. Now it's antivirus, firewalls, and managed services. Now
Well, that's
it's
only because the
antivirus.
threats advanced. They became more sophisticated.
Exactly. That's true.
It is a
Okay.
combination of both. It's, hey,
Yeah.
blame the attackers because they got smarter, but now add this.
It's a
Well,
complex system,
yeah,
right?
one
Complex system
one
we
of the
have to manage as we go along.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the comment that I just saw is the organization culture, right? That ties it in. And the organization culture is the biggest hurdle. That's the comment from our audience.
And right now, everybody's looking at these meetings. They look to the CFO because right now, it's if the CFO isn't in on this, they're not getting their budget. He's not getting an ROI to justify the
Well,
spend.
but I can tell you, hey, I'm a CFO as well. It's like, okay, why should I spend? And that's the question I keep challenging Fred and the engineer. It's like, how do you justify it, right? So I'm
This
the
is
devil's advocate, and let's play this game now.
yeah. Okay. And let me tell you right off the bat, although I came from IT security and worked up to the risk, and I got the risk bug. I remember the date or the year, and I remember where I was. I was
Keep
in
it clean.
Chantilly, Virginia. No, we're talking IT risk. Okay.
Okay.
I was in Chantilly, Virginia at a Starbucks, and I had just picked up a book on security metrics. Okay. Um, and I remember where it was when I got that bug. And I said, okay, this is at least part of the answer. All right. And so I started IT security. Yeah. Firewalls will protect you, control zones, antivirus, IDS, IPS, and all the other stuff that has come out in response to the attackers that has been less than effective because we we fire and forget. We put it in place and say, okay, we're all set now, but we're really not. Now, in defense of the CEOs and CFOs, and you're not going to, you're not going to hear a lot of people who have the roots in IT security defend them. But if somebody came to me with this scenario, I wouldn't give them money either. Okay, so picture you're the CEO, and Sean comes to you and says, we've looked at the investments that we have and we're kind of spread out. So we'd like to buy some options to hedge those investments and we can reduce our risk by $80 million. CEO says, yeah, 20 million for the options, reduction in risk of 80 million. That's fantastic. IT comes in and says, by the way, we've looked at the landscape and we really believe that if we buy this new next generation firewall, for example, we can reduce our risk from medium to medium high or medium low. Okay. There are no numbers
W-
attached.
yeah,
It's
what does
all
that mean, right?
what does that mean? Right. So,
Well, and this
so
is why
yeah.
part of it, it's like, yeah, I talked about it years ago, and the IT people has, we put ourselves into a vicious cycle of self-destruction.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I said that a decade ago. And the reason why is, yes, it's a two-way street that when the C-suites don't want to spend, whatever we asking. Of course, the IT people don't like them, right? But at the same time, a lot of IT people that I talk to never really thought about how I should communicate effectively to the C-suite so they can understand why they need to spend that budget or that money, right? So it becomes a vicious cycle. And then both ends are not going to be happy and eventually is self-destructed just because that the changing of the communication, and that is very challenging for a lot of folks, and that is why that we started off with data visualization and the screenshot that you shared earlier as part of that. And at the same time that these two group of people among the risk officers, the governors now, and then into the mix, and the technical solutions that the marketing people are doing fantastic, keep coming out with different terms that I could not even keep up on a daily basis. Oh my goodness, another new term. It's like, what does that really mean? And that makes it go back into when I started this conversation about confusion, about complexity. Now, going back and tied it into what we, into the risk management 82, 86, and suggested risk register, risk profile, risk quantifications, and you talking about crosswalk into HIPAA. Now, another challenge of that I have seen, just came back from the Asia Pacific, and one of the telecommunication service provider, of course I'm not going to name names, that got hacked, and they just continue to willing to pay the hacker. Meanwhile, yes, they are trying to fix whatever they have, uh, whatever the vulnerabilities are, to allow the hackers to continue to you know asking for ransomware. After 3 times of paying the ransomware, they still could not fix the problem. Now, how does that risk ties into changing that organization behavior in a sense? Because now in one sense that they promoting the ransomware, the hackers behavior, on the other hand they just could not find a way to change the tie. How does risk management would able to help this audience?
Well, years ago, I actually did fault tree analyses on major exploitations. Okay, and I focused primarily on Equifax, got results that surprised me. But then I applied it to other ones too. And this is all based on public information. And the fault tree analysis always showed that the exploitation was a failure in risk management. Okay. You cannot tell me that the the CRO or the CFO of Equifax did not realize that the potential impact of a breach was so high. Okay. You cannot tell me that with all the things they had in place, they didn't see the traffic banging against these servers. So it's a double-edged sword, right? So if you use risk management, there's no guarantees. Of course, there's no guarantees in life, but the entire thing about risk management is you can control your losses. In the case of the breach that you're talking about, for example, could be despite doing everything uh, known to man in IT security, short of air gapping everything, and basically rendering everything a brick. They might still have gotten hacked, but they would have been able to respond to it better. In fact, one of the sections in this CSF is on response. Um, and again, this is where it differs from ISO 27001 because it says, okay, you have to be able to do these things in response. Now, paying the ransomware, that's a business decision. That is not a risk decision. That's a business decision. So if they pay the ransomware to keep the lights on, they have made the determination that it's cheaper to do that to start getting income again or whatever than it is to do a DR, data recovery on all of their systems. right?
Yeah, but I could get
Just like that.
fired because if you fix the problem, I get fired.
No, no one's going to get fired for fixing the problem. You know, fixing the problem improperly, maybe, but um,
That goes along with your analogy about the driving and the complex system of driving. You can be the safest driver on the road. There is still the likelihood you're going to have an accident because of someone else's actions. It doesn't matter.
that's right.
You can take every precaution you possibly take, and it's still going to be out there. Hey,
Right,
I
but
wanted
as you improve your maturity as a driver, okay, you become more aware, you drive more defensively.
to.
Take a look at 16, 17-year-olds who just got their licenses. Their insurance is higher for a reason. Believe me, okay? Because they are not as experienced.
As a
Um,
parent of teenagers, you're telling
yeah,
me.
right. Yes. Yeah.
Boys
Well,
and girls, doesn't matter thanks to texting.
yep.
Hey, we have a question here, and since you're the smartest guy here today, Fred, I'm going to ask you to put on your hat and look into the future, Karnak, and look into the future. What's it look like 5 years out if the current cybersecurity state, the environment, stays the same as nation state actors continue to grow in their capabilities? And I might just add, it doesn't have to be nation state actors. You have a lot of organizations that are engaged by the nation state to do certain activities. Those groups keep the tools they were given for the nation state activities, keep the tools and do it on their own. They freelance. That's how they run their criminal organizations. So if things don't change, what's it going to look like in 5 years?
We are always playing whack-a-mole. We have been since PCs first started coming out. I kind of long to the days of mainframes, and my experience with mainframes was very limited. Okay, just university mainframes, right? But the whole centralized control, centralized security, limited access, um, also the ring zero versus ring one architecture of the CPUs and everything else like that. Okay, um, I long for those days because it really was simpler. The problem
Oh, but in
is,
fact, that the World Economic Forum just came out with the global risk report in 2023 for 2023 this year. Cybercrime and cyber misinformation will remain on the eighth of the top 10 for the next 10 years. So that kind of answer that it's going to be continue to be a problem. But again, it's just like now you guys are talking about a driver, and goes back into the statistics that why we need to have this type of risk management based on fact to measure against your organizations to see which way to steer, or do we need to increase the cyber insurance because the company is still in a early stage of maturity. And because that, well, the way that I look at it, that it will remain in our system, in our society for the next 20, 30 years until
Easily.
quantum computing
Right.
become widely available. That's going to change that aspect. For good, for better, nobody know. And also, of course, the adaptation of AI nowadays, how that is going to change the curve. But that's what World Economic Forum has already putting out the fact that it's going to be remain, on the eighth position for the next 10 years.
and they're wrong.
So how do we change, and going back, I'm sorry, Fred, I'm going to let you talk about. So
Yeah.
how are we going to change the organizational behavior today to make that impact into cyber resilience?
I got
Sorry, Fred.
yelled. No problem. I got yelled at once by my boss at one of the companies I worked at for saying there is no absolute security, and that is a true statement. But it goes contrary um, to the sales techniques out there, right? Now, where are we going to be in 5 years with all the increased attacks? Stanley mentioned AI. There's a lot of talk about AIs being able to craft the perfect phishing email, and they can, okay? but the question is, how do you combat that? For one thing, and I'll probably be keel hauled for this, but does every employee in your organization need internet access beyond the web-based applications that they have?
Mm,
Does every employee need unlimited access to the internet, or could you suffice with business critical um, white lists to
right,
control that access?
right.
Do you
You know,
have to let all of the email into your environment, or can you whitelist email addresses and say, okay, here's a new address to whitelist, and keep up with that whitelist, and
right.
thereby reduce or eliminate phishing attacks?
In one of my previous lives, we had a system for the warehouse, and the barcode scanners for the pickers had to communicate with the packers, and we were using Windows CE, and the packers were using Windows 7 machines. And with the Microsoft change on support for those, we ended up having to isolate those. And to your point, those devices were only able to communicate with the application to do the job, nothing external in order to secure those machines. So they couldn't go to their Facebook, they couldn't open the external emails, and we had some pretty sophisticated email filtering systems on there as well. That was one of my questions. Where do you see, with this complexity, where do you see automation and AI coming in to kind of fill that gap? Because the skills aren't there, the manual processes are slower and longer, that can't react fast enough. So where do you see AI and automation coming in to deal with this complex system?
Well, we've kind of come full circles. Years ago, there was something that was touted called an executive information system in the EIS, where based on input from or output actually from experts, you could make all these decisions. The problem is the experts could not articulate how they made those decisions. With AI, it's the same thing. The output of an AI is not the text and chat GTP.
Right.
That's the final product, but the output is actually an array of numbers that you don't know how it arrived at this. So we're back in the same place. We don't know how these things are making the decisions, and I'm not against AI. I'm against AGI because I want the Earth to survive, and once it comes out, it won't. But AI can help, but it can also just be another dead end in our quest. You
Sure.
know, auto drive, autopilot, right? Um, I would not have hit that tractor trailer pulled across the road like the Tesla did, right? Um, most people wouldn't. So where do we give up the control and
Right.
for a
Right.
different control? Yeah.
So somebody posted here about Lloyd's change in their coverage and the nation state attacks, and they're looking at it as an act of war. If you're attacked and they can tie it in any way to a nation state actor, they're not going to pay out. And we'll touch briefly on the cybersecurity. So Stanley and I have spent a lot of time talking about cyber insurance liability coverage for people. We see it as the last line of defense, but those information security reviews that they ask you to fill out are all ways that they're not going to pay out to you if there's a claim on the policy. Because if you answer anything and they can demonstrate that you were in violation of that claim, they're just not going to pay it out. So you need to be really careful with those things. And Stanley, we were talking to one
And I can't
client.
blame them. Yeah.
Yeah, but it goes back. If they can tie it in any way to a nation state, if the group has done work with the nation state before, they're just going to tie it to the nation state and not pay the claim.
Yeah,
And
and
so,
and I support that. Now, why do I support that? Because they're in business to make money too.
right,
Okay, and the the stringency, the stringent applications now. I mean, years ago, you want a policy, here it is, right? And then they started getting actuarial data,
right.
historical
That's what they never
probabilities,
had
right?
enough of. to do
Right.
that kind of calculation.
Now they have it, and they can correlate that this attack was at least partially enabled because they had 217 domain admin accounts in their organization.
Well, it was
When
also freewheeling insurance companies that were just willing to pay it out because it was easier.
right, well, that too, yes, but
Stanley, did you want to chime in on the application of AI and automation to solve these complex issues that Fred was talking about?
Oh, I mean, Fred and I always agree on that because AI will help. But are we going to let AI to control our destiny? The answer is,
Right,
of course, is no. And go back into the insurance company. And again, it's like, yeah, they need to make money. And at the same time, where does the responsibility really lies? I think it's go back into myself, right? I need to take the responsibility to try to do the right thing. And that is partially why I brought it out earlier about this self destruction, the vicious cycle of self destruction, is because a lot of people say, well, I'm going to wait until my management to give me the budget. And then, of course, the upper management is, well, I'm going to wait my IT guy to show me the return on investment or the cost justification so I can now do both sides would wait forever. So how can we start breaking that tie? And what we, of course, in Nest Switch and
right,
securely in Asia have been trying to do is to influence this behavioral changes by doing what we exactly doing educations, right? So
right,
this is the first thing that we have been we've decided why we're doing this type of live LinkedIn or the podcast and started the cyber risk governance group is not because we have time to burn, is because that we need to change that behavior and to hopefully the audience would agree with us and everybody start doing their own part little bit at a time. And another question that goes back into wrap it up this session is where do we start, right? I mean, I hear that question so many times, and that's why we're using the NIST 8286. All right, don't believe me, don't trust me, go read it on your own. And now why I asked Fred to define a lot further, than just the 8286 for today, and then looking into why we look at it as a risk management, or why NIST and ISO and other organizations look at this as risk management. And it was only what 8 years ago, 7 years ago that we started this journey, and now has already changed into tiding into the GRC and risk management into the technical equation. But at the same time, lots of people think AI is going to you know resolve this problem. I don't think so.
well, remember we have AI, but so do they.
right.
Well,
Um,
and AI as old as I am, so
yeah,
hasn't changed.
yeah, yeah,
I'm not going to tell you my age.
yeah.
Well, Stanley, you and I have talked
So,
about really sort of it being augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, using the automation of the AI to really facilitate knowledge sharing and information to those that have the brain power to make the decisions, to deal with these
and yeah,
complex,
and on top of
decision
that is
making.
reinforced machine learning
Right.
capability I learned from Fred, right? So
Right.
yeah, so that's another part of it. We have to take some responsibility to start the process. And where do we start? And again, baseline assessment, we keep talking about it. And now,
Yeah.
yes, AI do help when it comes to monitoring and then addressing some of the attack and the false positive. And we had deployed that, boy, how many years ago?
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, that helps to reduce some of the false positive. What, 6, 7 years ago, we started that, in a sim with the AI component of it, and then the antivirus you mentioned earlier, has the deep narrow network capability. So yes, it helps, but I think it's the behavior needs to change. And again, when every time I hear people got hacked, and yeah, they just pay ransomware. I'm talking about a lot of those companies that I heard, and they are publicly trading companies in some of their areas too. So wow, great, wonderful. No wonder the criminal activity will continue to rise. and why triggers into the cyber insurance, why the insurance company won't cover the nationwide state attacks.
Right.
We all know how many billions of dollars North Korea made out of cyber criminal acts. Well, I mean, according to the statistics,
Yeah.
billions, hundreds of billions. Well, again, whose fault is that?
Right.
And that's a question for our CRG group to answer.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all. Right on top of the hours. Thank you, Fred. Pulling you
Thank
out of
you.
the server room. To give you some sunshine. Well, thank you everyone for joining. So join us back in the CRG group, Cyber Risk Governance group in the LinkedIn, and we'll
And
see you next time.
if you want the presentation or a replay of the video, I'll be posting comments where to find those.
All right, cool.
Thanks
Bye,
for joining.
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.